right, welcome to the Demystifying MTB podcast, where we talk about all the tricky bits related to mountain biking. This podcast is presented by myself, Matt Miller, aka MTB PhD, and Rohan Martin, aka Sweaty Techie. The podcast is brought to you by BrakeAce. And the whole reason we started BrakeAce is to demystify your ride. BrakeAce collects complex data and presents it to you in an easy-to-action way so you know where to improve your riding. And that's exactly what we're going to do with this podcast. We cover all the aspects of mountain biking to get you riding faster, having more fun, and owning the mountain. All right, Rohan. So we're going to have a little bit of a follow-up. Last episode, we talked about bigger rotors and why everyone needs bigger rotors. Actually,
Everyone.
Lots happened since then. We had that Pink Bike article go out of the factory tour. What did you think of that? That was pretty cool.
Good. Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah.
Good to see the discussions that it's bringing up.
Yeah.
Lots of the right questions being asked. Different people with their own opinions, obviously.
Yeah.
But
it's funny. Yeah, you mentioned nothing about the article and everything about the comments.
Absolutely. It's Pink Bike.
Yeah.
It's the article itself. Well, I knew all the content of the article just because that is my life. So yeah, the comments were the exciting thing for me. The article itself it's nice to have some good photos out there.
Yeah, definitely. What still blows my mind is that there's still people, because this is now I think like the fourth article on the like maybe not on BrakeAce itself, but like on the idea of measuring braking and mountain biking. So even from like years ago with the first ever sensor, where they did a press release from Interbike and all that, and then like it followed along with each iteration, including like the Kickstarter launch. And there's still people that have never heard of it. I'm like, how have you never heard of this? This has been like out there, and it's still like everyone that commented is seeing it for the first time. Like, wow, that's crazy, because I feel like we've been in everyone's face. But
you say that I missed a race last weekend that I didn't find out was happening until the night before, and it was 3 hours drive away. But I would have really liked to join in, but all of the advertising was on social media.
Yeah.
And I'd just been so caught up in other things that I hadn't been doing enough scrolling to find out what events were happening.
That's true. That one happens to me a lot.
The wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, because
important things just skip on by.
Press releases, especially, like it's there and then it's gone, right? So that one would be buried from the Pink Bike homepage by now, and the next thing is up. But yeah, it was very exciting couple days of DMs, emails, people signing up, people pre-ordering. It was pretty insane. So glad we did it. And big thanks to Alex for making that happen from the European Bike Project. That was very cool.
Yeah, and the Oceania Bike Project.
Yeah.
It's got both happening now.
Yeah. That must be hard to manage, like multiple dope Instagram accounts. But yeah, he does it, and it's very cool. So
yeah, I've also got to thank him for touring around New Zealand and posting up social media content about all the different places he was going, because I think I was about a week behind him. And so I took some advice on the different places that I could go and ride.
Oh, cool.
So cheers, Alex.
Yeah, I think he rode every day he was in New Zealand, like maybe a few days off, but he was riding a lot. So he rode a lot of trails. So yeah, good on him.
So now on the note of saying it's hard to be found and things disappear very quickly, if you're listening to this, tell your friends about us. They probably need to know all the things that you're happily learning, unless of course you want to be the guy in your group that knows everything because you're just repeating everything Matt says to you. So I try and pretend I know more than I do just by quoting Matt to my mates.
Same. I'm always like quoting these tech things that I know nothing about, but I'm like, well, I heard Rohan say it, so it's at least true.
But
it's true.
Tell your friends.
Yeah, we need like some sort of gentleman's agreement here. Like, if you're not out there buying BrakeAce, you need to share this podcast with your friends, because we exist to make BrakeAce, and we do this podcast as like one of the other zillions of things we have to do as part of a really small team making a really complex product. So if you're listening to this, the gentleman's agreement is that you need to share this podcast with your friends or buy BrakeAce. Those are your only two options. Otherwise, you just stop listening to all this free content that we're giving you.
Is it a gentleman's agreement for all the women who are listening?
Well, I honestly, I stole that concept from another podcast, and they just call it a gentleman's agreement, even though there are women. But yeah, so we can call it whatever you want, but that should be the agreement. So buy BrakeAce or share this with your friends. Both are pretty
and
easy.
it will hopefully mean some more faff-free rides.
Absolutely.
More people know about how their bikes work and what they're doing. Less faffing, less wasted time. More time shredding trails.
Yeah. So you had this question about you since we talked about the rotor sizes, we wanted to also talk about like maybe bedding in pads or like why everyone's brakes suck.
So we got some questions after the last episode we've put out there. If you have questions, let us know. Reach out. BrakeAce socials are probably the best place. Questioning glazed pads that I'd mentioned and making your brakes work properly, knowing that they don't work. So yeah, pad bedding is part of that. And pad bedding can be talked about for hours for many different approaches that can be taken. There's different ways people tell you to do it. Overall, it's not that complicated. It's the idea of
it's not
making your brakes work.
No one does it. It's crazy how no one does it.
Well, it's crazy how many bike shops will sell a bike without telling someone you should bed your brakes in. Like they've just sold you a great piece of machinery that isn't going to work as well as it could if it's not set up correctly. And so they'll go through and find out your weight and check your sag when they're putting air pressure in. They'll check your saddle height and put you on, make sure you're on the right size, but not make your brakes work. So the idea of pad bedding, how would you explain it, Matt?
Well, you have like these two totally different materials, right? So pads could be made out of like a whole host of different things. And even if it's called one material, it's a mixture of different materials with usually like different levels of copper, I think. Like different levels of copper, like it's all kind of shredded up into a pulp. And then I don't know how they get it all onto the backing, but
We've got some mushed pulp stuck to a backing.
This is like going to be the most bro-y science thing I feel like I've ever put out there because I don't know enough about the compounds. And that
we don't make brake pads and we don't pretend we do. But we've worn a few out and we've worn a few in.
Yeah, we're still going to demystify something here. You just bear with us. Yeah. So like what the pads do is they sandwich against a rotor, right? And since we talked about this on the last episode, what it does is it converts your kinetic energy of you moving into heat. They're just basically just friction surfaces. So they when they touch each other, you want as much friction as possible because that's what they do. And then they accept heat. So heat will go into your rotor and heat will go into your pads. And you want it to basically stop there and not go into your fluid because then you lose your brakes. So there are different kinds of pad compounds. And what you want to do when you get your stainless steel rotors, which is what they're generally all made out of, you want to transfer some of this pad material evenly across your rotor. So like a brake rotor, there's actually zero technology in it. It's a hunk of metal that is ground perfectly flat.
I wouldn't say zero, but
compared
to the rest of the bike.
Yeah, especially those new SRAM rotors, the HS. I always forget what they're called, HSC or HS2 or something. I can't remember the thick ones. The technology in those is like how they make them nice and flat, and that's why you can see the multiple colors on them. So it's like this special grinding technology. So the technology actually in the rotor itself is just that the braking surface is ground in lots of different ways, right? So it's nice and flat, but also there's a lot of surface area for how flat it actually is. So when you start braking, you want to transfer some of your pad material onto that rotor so that they just work better. And if you do this in like
more friction.
Yes. If you do it in a bad way, like you pulse the brakes when you're trying to bed them in, what you'll do is you'll end up with an uneven distribution of this pad material on your rotor. And just like braking bumps out on the trail, your rotor's only going to get worse if you continue hard braking with an uneven and unevenly distributed pad material on your rotor.
Yeah, and when you say when you bed in your brakes, we're not just talking about actively going, okay, I'm heading out on the street in front of my house and doing some laps and bedding in my brakes. If you haven't actively done that, then you're bedding in your brakes on your first ride. So it's basically
which is
bedding
uneven.
in. Yeah, is just when you first start adding brake compound to your brake pad compound to your brake rotor. However you go that. And so, yeah, if you're out on your first ride, depending on the ride, it might actually work really well because you might be braking nice and consistently on and off without totally stopping, without overheating. It might just work. And a lot of the time, the way that we bed our brakes is exactly how we ride the trail anyway. So you might get lucky.
You might get lucky. I think the chances of getting lucky are pretty slim just because of how bumpy like trails are. And, you know, it's really interesting because where I bed my pads in, I live on like this gentle hill. It doesn't feel gentle at the end of a long ride, I'll tell you that. But when I go down and I bed my pads in, there's a few kind of like lumps in the road. And I can feel that actually during hard braking if I don't kind of make sure that I ride the smoothest way down the road. And I can feel it in what coming to a stop. And if I hadn't bed them in it properly, coming to a stop kind of pulses my brake for me, which I don't want. And if you think about how you might brake when you're, you know, air quotes, bedding your pads in on the trail, you're going to be hitting bumps the whole time. So you're going to be rolling over rocks or different like trail surfaces. It's going to be bumpy, not going to be smooth.
Even if it is perfectly smooth in terms of sort of up down, because of those different surfaces, it's not going to be smooth in terms of traction. So
Right.
You're going to be up and down in terms of the amount of force that's turning your wheels as you're braking.
Yeah. You know, we could almost do a whole episode on just bedding in your pads, but let's save that because
So now we just basically said what the idea of
yeah,
pad bedding is. Like, okay, so we're making our brakes have friction on both surfaces.
yes. I just want to tease that though real quickly because we will do a podcast episode on it because we wrote a whole article about it and never published it. Like all the data included.
Putting BrakeAce to use and actually seeing
like actually
the change
measured bedding with
braking.
BrakeAce. Yeah. So yeah, we'll save that. When you say glazed rotors or glazed pads, like what is the phenomena that you're noticing, or that like obviously not you, but your mates that didn't bed their materials in properly?
Oh,
what
well, this was me.
Oh,
the
no.
example we gave the last episode was riding down a super steep trail with small rotors by myself. So somewhat trying to go probably slower than I actually would have been best going, and dragging brakes the whole way. And I'd commented in that episode about basically being able to see my reflection in the pads. And that's because glazing basically gives your pads a reflective sheen to them, because as you've pressed with a lot of pressure and a lot of heat your pad into your rotor, it eventually does the opposite job of trying to put pad material onto the rotor, as now the rotor's just pressed in so hard against the pad that it has made it totally smooth. So all of the little bits of pad material that you want to move from the pad to the rotor have now just moved into all the little holes and imperfections in the pad. And you've now perfectly made it smooth. So now you have this pad that is a perfectly smooth surface that you can basically reflect your light back at you in. And you've got your rotor is a perfectly smooth surface that really is a mirror. You can potentially even see your own face in it, pressing against each other. So we've now basically the same as going ice skating. You've got a smooth surface on a smooth surface. That's a little different, but yeah, there's very little friction.
Ice against your rotor and trying to stop in a way, right? Like you can imagine that wouldn't work great.
Or even just the idea of getting down to metal on metal. If you have no pad material, you've totally worn out your pads, you have this horrible grinding noise, but you also have very little ability to stop. And that's exactly what's happened here. Even though all of this fancy combination of materials is there, it's hidden behind this glazed over, smooth, hard surface.
So why do you think that happened on your bike?
So my bike, it would have been heat and pressure for a long time. And so at no point giving it a chance to let off enough to cool down and let off enough for those little pieces of pad material to dislodge. So you just get more and more pressed together, smoother and smoother surface.
Yeah.
And so this can happen for anyone riding a long trail, but can also happen for someone who's just dragging the brakes a lot on a less steep trail. You need enough force that the pad material doesn't shift with the rotor, and you need enough heat to have it be able to sort of reform back into a solid material. But there's a lot of different ways you can make this happen, and it's generally some combination of using your brakes too much.
Which sometimes, like, one of the comments someone left was, "Oh, BrakeAce is just going to show me I'm braking too much." Well, no, that's not obviously not like what it does. It shows you where you can improve.
You're not original if you make that comment.
Yeah, I know. That's why I roll my eyes whenever I see it, because, like, come on, like, do you want to get better? Like, did you spend 10 grand on that Kashima coated suspension to be as good as you were before, or are you trying to get better? So, or ride smoother, or just have more fun? But I forget actually where I was going with that. But
you just wanted a chance to tell people to stop making that comment, because you're not dragging your brakes the whole way down.
Please stop that one. Come on, Matt, you got this one. You can find where you were going with it. What we don't want to say is that, like, dragging your brakes is like the least desirable thing to ever happen, because we need to use our brakes to ride properly, right?
Yeah.
So
I could tell you, going down the trail I was talking about then, it was the end of a day. I knew there was a group of guys behind me, so it wasn't totally bad, but this was leaving the bike park out into the wilderness, down the side of a cliff. My brakes were saving me. Like, literally my life would have been over if I didn't have brakes.
Yeah.
So dragging your brakes can't generally be called a bad thing.
No, and like, bike parts wear out anyway, but this is kind of, these are the things that wear your brake pads out more quickly.
Yeah, and on that same trip over to Queenstown, I had a mate who was riding his bike, I'd say pretty tentatively compared to his usual riding, but he had previously gone on a end of year group trip and ripped his knee open first run of the first day, or maybe even before the first run, and wasn't able to ride the entire rest of the trip. So don't blame him for not pushing it full send the whole time.
Fair.
But once we got home again, he went for a ride and his brakes were howling just in the car park. It was awful. So he kept riding a little bit, and then he's like, "What's going on?" And in the car park, someone had noticed that his caliper was a little loose, and he just put new rotors on, and we'd bedded them in for him, and it was all seemed okay. But once he'd moved on to his next ride, it was just awful. And what had happened is, over that whole trip through Queenstown, he was riding 180mm rotors, and he just had the twin pot brakes, and so he was dragging them probably a lot more than more powerful brakes, just because he knew he had a limit to how much power he could get. And he glazed over his pads, but hadn't noticed, and so was riding with poor brakes. And instead of that meaning, "Oh, now you've got no brakes, you go fast," it's, now you've got no brakes, you're on them a lot more, because you don't trust that you can slow down. And so his speed was impacted, his control was impacted, but he didn't actually notice directly. And so, checking over these parts that wear out, brakes especially, is definitely worthwhile. And glazed pads is super easy to check. Pop your pads out, give them a little bit of a twist side to side with the light, and see if they look rough, or do they reflect the light back at you.
Is there anything you can do if you have glazed pads?
So this guy, middle of the ride, we hadn't really gone down. Well, actually, we'd done one crazy down, which I don't know how we survived, and we were at the top of the next one. I was like, "Can I just have a look at your pads to see if it's more than just noise?" because it's never just noise. There's always a reason. It's pretty much always contamination of some sort, whether that's poor bedding or something on your brakes, which we should mention as well. So I popped these pads out, put some water on them, basically making some friction. So rubbed both sides, or both pads together. So put them hard, flat against each other, so you still got a flat surface, and just moved back and forth, ran in some circles, acting like sandpaper, trying to get them. And straight away, grit started coming off.
Yeah, like what did the water look like? Was it just black water all over?
Yeah, well, it was almost like a paste, because the start of the water was super hot out there, and water started to flow off, and you're left with just the water between the pads. And that just very quickly starts breaking up this compound again. And just, yeah, had this fine paste, wiped that off, did it a bit more, put them on, brakes working significantly better straight away. If you're at home, you can just use some fine sandpaper. If you're at home, I'd say by that point, potentially just look at new pads, clean off those ones, scrape them down, have them as spares. But yeah, you can on the trail or at home just replenish, making them rough. So you don't want to take big chunks out of your pads, because then they're just going to fall apart. But you can make them quite rough just by rubbing smooth, fine grit sandpaper or the other pad with some water against them. Get rid of that sheen. They're still flat, but now they've got some very fine imperfections.
Do you ever use brake cleaner?
That's a tough question. Yes, I do. And usually after a long drive down the highway with the bike on the back of the car, where oil and grit and grime is just gone everywhere. Some points, you're just the only way to get the brakes clean is something quite harsh. If I'm able to look after my bike, I'll just use isopropyl alcohol to clean everything on the brakes. Not necessarily just because of the brake surface not wanting to be contaminated, but all the rest of your brakes. If your seals start deteriorating, you can't fix them again. If you get contaminants inside your caliper that's still there and then sort of oozes into your brakes while you're riding, that's going to have an impact. So I try to avoid the more harsh brake cleaners, but sometimes, well, clean is always better than dirty.
Yeah, definitely.
And so,
tell you,
yes.
What I do, I love a good brake cleaner. And like, you don't want to get that stuff on your hands. Although, to be fair, I've been getting a lot of chemicals on my hands from like bonding strain gauges and like preparing surfaces that I probably shouldn't have. But brake cleaner is gnarly. But what happens, so this is what I do. I take the pads out and like I always bed them in properly every time. And you'd be surprised at some of the brake pads that I'm actually using and actually loving. So we'll just leave it at that. But try some cheap ones and see what you think. But what I do is I take them out, and I had to do this because I had haze, and there must have been an air bubble in them. So I always had to reset the pistons. And to do that, I had the pads out anyway. So I was like, well, I'll just clean them. So here I am, like resetting my pistons every like 3 rides. So I'm cleaning my pads every 3 rides and blasting them with brake cleaner. And it's insane the amount of contaminants that come out when you blast it and with brake cleaner. So then I would take the rotor and clean that as well. And it was insane, like a clean looking rotor, all this dirt comes out. And obviously it's in between like those little cutouts where the dirt definitely hangs out. But if you can get that off, that dirt at least isn't going to go onto your pads. So now you have like 2 nicely clean surfaces that are, in a way mated to each other because of the grooves that they've created by pressing against each other with whatever dirt was in there before. And now you got some really nice surfaces, really nice clean surfaces, and you got good working brakes all the time. It's fantastic. So yeah, I love a good brake cleaner.
I'd say on that, use a lint-free cloth. The amount of people I see using just like shop towel that leaves bits. Yeah. And like it's going to add up. That if you've got
literally contamination.
Yeah, it's going to hold any contaminants in there as well.
You're melting that. You're melting that whatever, I don't know what a shop rag is made out of, polyester. Like plastic. Yeah, polyester. You then melt that on the rotor. Like you just contaminated your rotor by using that rag.
And whatever was on that rag, even if it's just your oil from your hand in that rag, now you've melted that with the rag into the rotor. But yeah, it's definitely contaminants in your pads is almost impossible to fix once you've got something soaked into your pads. But if there's only a little bit, yeah, get some brake cleaner on there. Anything that's an aerosol, don't just spray it. Anyway, even if it's something that should be safe, don't spray it around your bike. Take your pads, take your rotor, take them away from your bike, use it somewhere with the rag to stop it. Like spray it onto the rag, then use it rather than just spray it open.
Yeah.
But if you can get anything out of the pads, they will work nicer. I bought a secondhand dirt jumper. It came with totally contaminated pads. But if I pop them out, rub them on a rag that's been soaked in brake cleaner, I can get a ride out of them before I've basically worn through enough to get to whatever contaminant was in there.
Oh, no, bummer.
But the rotor's already dead. The pads, they're terrible brakes that don't really work anyway. It definitely impacts my confidence once they start wearing out, but it's like, yep, quick and easy, done. I've got to find some pads that actually fit to be able to replace that, but you can save pads. Maybe then like, oh, you can put them in the oven and heat them up. It's probably not going to do that much.
No, I've also heard the one where you like just burn the surface, and what all that does though is creates ash.
And it's also exactly what you're trying not to do when you're using your brakes is add direct heat to the one surface. And so now at least you don't have pressure going with that. But yeah, you've changed the chemical composition of the surface.
Yeah, I must say I've never tried it, but I don't think I will.
But yeah, I think your general advice is cleaner. If you get all of the gunk off, yeah, I like isopropyl. If I've got a nice clean rag, an isopropyl, it'll evaporate afterwards. So even if I don't get it perfectly clean, I also haven't added anything that's going to stay. Yeah. And generally, I've just got isopropyl around anyway. I throw it around willy-nilly on everything.
Yeah, it does go a long way. What if we run into a situation where we can't, like that doesn't work? Then what do we replace first, the rotor or the pads? Or both? What do you think?
Well, one thing I have heard, which does sort of make sense, is if you're changing brake compound, pad compound, I should say, you should change your rotor.
Yep, definitely.
And because of what we're saying about bedding in your pads, you've left some compound on the rotor. And so you want to have those two surfaces have as much friction as possible. And the best way to do that is have them sort of be matching material composition.
Absolutely.
So yeah, if you're changing from organic to metallic, or whatever you want to call them, then yeah, switch your rotor as well.
Yeah, I think this is because of the different heats that each pad will operate at ideally. So there would be maybe some trapped compounds. Let's say if you used resin pads and then switched to metal, and the metal pads would probably heat up a little bit more slowly than the resin ones, which means more heat would be going into the rotor, which you can see how this would just lead to so many problems.
Well, it's also the heat is different, which is why they last, like metallic will last longer, partly because they won't heat up as quickly, but they also won't bite as quickly because they don't heat up. And something that's hotter is softer, and therefore it has more ability to grip. It creates more traction. And so every brake has an optimal temperature, and it's not cold. When you say like, oh yeah, my brakes have overheated, but they can also be underheated and they're not functional correctly. And so if you've got metallic compound on there, it's going to heat up more slowly, but that also means it's now harder than the organic compound, and it's going to actually rip through the soft rather than grip onto the soft organic compound.
Yeah. You know,
so it all comes down to heat.
Yeah. Fun fact here. Everyone might think that I've heard this weird thing that if you're fast, you use metal pads. Just because, like, I don't know why. This like sounds like way tougher, I guess. But a lot of the World Cup guys are using resin pads for exactly that reason. Like, it's there when they need them. And also what the general feeling is amongst these people that do that is that by using resin pads, you're actually saving your rotor because the pads heat up quicker, which means your rotor heats up slower. And I totally agree with that. So resin pads, I think, are the way to go. Basically for all applications. I can't really think of many.
I do agree, but I ride metallic because riding on pea gravel with very little grip, if I'm riding organic pads, I notice that little bit more bite. But the problem is I have such little traction to work with that I'm trying, same as I mentioned last time, I want modulation. Overall power is less important to me than the ability to control my brakes because I so easily get into a skid. And so I find that organic pads just grip that little bit too quickly to have that precision modulation. So I'm deliberately basically downgrading the performance of my pads so that I don't skid so easily.
Interesting. So we should do a test, right? To see if like by having the metal pads, you end up braking a longer time or skidding less versus, the resin ones. That'd be like quite a cool test. But
because this has not been scientifically proven. So far, this is just my own bro science saying,
that's an interesting one that, obviously I don't know what it's like to ride on pea gravel. I saw some of the stuff you're riding on that you put up on Instagram the other day. I was like, that's pea gravel. That is like definition of pea gravel. And
I'll have to get some close-up photos.
Yeah.
Marbles. It is marbles.
I can't even imagine, to be honest. But yeah, I don't know what it's like to ride in that. And obviously, like these pads compounds exist for a reason. Part of me is like, well, no one knows anything about mountain bike braking, in the first place, like to actually testing it out there, like how people are actually using them. I think eventually one day we'll have, like, if you live here and you ride these trails in this way, these are the pads that you need. Like, it'll definitely be that way. So we can have like the most precise equipment, like the ideal equipment that we should be using. It's not there yet, but it'd be really cool to do that test.
Yeah. I would say because there hasn't been any real testing, there's not any real knowledge that's out there. Okay, each brand has their different reasoning for why their pads would be better. For me, I've been working on BrakeAce. I haven't been paid in a very long time. I'm going with the ones that last longer. I wear out tires far too quickly to also wear out pads.
Yeah, fair enough.
And maybe I just don't have the time to deal with it too much. But I've always got the spares. Make sure if they do stop working, I can change them out, which was the question you asked. Pads or rotors? I'd say if you're only changing one, definitely pads. Pads hold grit, grime, contaminants. They are overall a soft material. If anything has had a chance to contact your brakes, it's had a chance to seep in to the pads. And while that may also be on the rotor, it's not so far into the rotor. And so a good clean will make it better. Not 100% better, but better than it was. Whereas pads, a good clean might make the surface better, which you're going to wear off during your first ride and potentially straight away be down, or maybe after a couple of rides, to that contaminate that's seeped in anyway.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The only thing I would add is that if you're replacing your pads like for the second or third time, you should also think about trying a new rotor. Like if you replace the pads and you're still iffy on the performance of your brakes, a rotor will make a world of difference, an absolute world of difference. New pads, new rotors, or even clean pads with new rotors.
Yeah.
So,
and on that, I would say majority of people don't replace their rotors often enough.
No.
They're so, we're talking less than 2 millimeters thick for the majority of rotors. They wear down a fraction of that. You don't see it. But in terms of the overall mass of the rotor, and we're talking about this ability to have it absorb heat and take it away from the brakes, you want every little bit of mass possible. Not to mention they turn into super sharp, deadly spikes spinning around.
Did you see there's this new rotor by Braking? Most people in the mountain bike world, I would say, have never heard of Braking, but they're called Braking. They're an Italian company. They make a 3 mil thick rotor. I just saw it today, actually this morning.
Do they make their own brake calipers to work with that?
Yeah. So Braking is like the most used. There's like in the motor world, there's Brembo and there's Braking. So these guys, They know what's up when it comes to making brakes. And they're the only company, I'll tell you this, they're the only company in the mountain bike space that is making their high-end brake as a 2-piston caliper. So this is their top of the line caliper. It's 2 pistons. They're massive pistons. We'll have to talk about pistons someday, but
I was gonna say, we probably shouldn't get into that
no,
now.
we'll save
what
it. But
actually matters.
yeah, we don't run their stuff, but I've met the guys. They're cool, and I'm just throwing out there that I want to try that. So
yeah,
I want those
I'll
rotors.
just
I want
say
those calipers.
the physics says that 4-piston isn't necessarily better than 2-piston, but it does say that 3 mil thick has some benefits over 2 or less.
Yeah.
But at some point, it's like you are getting just too much. You might not need it.
I don't know where that number is.
That's something that we need to check the numbers of.
Yep. I'll save it for next time or another time.
Okay, yeah. Let's leave it there.
All right. Awesome. Catch you next time.
Hey, see ya.